When she next entered the room at around noon, she brought a bowl of broth with her for Teague to sip. She found he might have sooner tossed it at her than eaten it. He was out of bed and moving around the room on crutches, his mechanical leg left in its corner as an unnecessary nuisance. He would neither stop to eat nor to acknowledge her entrance or Papa's exit with the chamber pot he'd filled. Every so often he would halt abruptly, hold his breath, and then slowly let it out. When he did so, Annalie noticed his hands shaking while they held onto the crutches. After a couple more hours of his restless wandering around the room, he stayed still enough to look out the window for several minutes. It was either too far off the ground or not far enough. Annalie figured it depended on his purposes. "Won't you lie down?" she said. "You tire me out watching you circle the room." He stood a moment longer, but then obeyed her. As he lowered himself to the edge of the bed, he heaved as if to vomit, but then swallowed the nausea down and breathed deliberately until it passed enough for him to speak. "Please." Annalie might have gone to her father's desk now if she could. Papa was right to keep the key to himself. She was too weak to let Teague get better. She wished she could apologize for her complicity in his suffering, but she only managed, "No." Through her early supper and the hours she was supposed to use for her chance at sleep, Annalie pictured the look of complete isolation on Teague's face when he realized she meant what she said. But when she was jarred from her light dozing by incessant banging a couple of hours before her shift, the memory was replaced by images of Teague struggling with Papa or John, or perhaps both. The door of his room was locked when she reached it, and the key was pushed out into the hall through the crevice between the door and the floor. She heard Papa and John inside trying to calm Teague down, but instead of banging now, he was throwing curses at them, alternately calling on God to damn them and damning God himself in a voice that cracked like a little boy's. Then he'd stop mid-exclamation, and Annalie would hear the rhythmic groans and intakes of air from Teague's vomiting. He'd lie still, she supposed, for a few minutes, only before his tirade would build again. If there had been anything breakable in the room, she imagined it would already have been smashed. He vomited so many times between rages there couldn't have been anything left to come up. She sat outside the door, clenching the key between her fingers, long after time for her shift came. Only when the room had been quiet for several minutes did she dare knock. "Annalie," Papa called through the wood. "Slide the key under." She waited a few minutes for him to open the door, but when he did, the smell of the vomit-laden linens he held in his arms made her turn away. Papa didn't say anything, but simply walked past her and down the stairs to dispose of his bundle. John stood with his head down against the back of a chair. Teague might have seemed to have fallen asleep sitting up in bed, if not for the blanket pulled up around his ears to give him the appearance of an old woman in a shawl, and if not for the slow rocking he did with his arms folded in front of him. It was mesmerizing to watch him, and even when he lay down on his side he continued the back-and-forth motion. Papa returned with a pan of chipped icicles, and kneeled beside the bed to force a piece through Teague's lips. Teague chewed it and opened his mouth for another. He ate 2 more before Annalie moved her chair to the side of the bed, took the pan from Papa, and started placing the chips on Teague's tongue herself. Saturday, 31st January, 1863. I've long suspected Dr. Warner's partiality to me, which has now been proven. He has little enough to say on his rounds, certainly, since there's nothing much the matter with me besides this cough that has stayed with me from my illness. In fact, I'd been expecting to be released at any time before I caught the pneumonia, and was feeling my fault in wasting a perfectly good bed. My discharge papers finally came through yesterday, which means that I'm no longer entitled to be a patient here. But while I was gathering my meager belongings this morning, he approached me with an offer of work. He said he could manage to have me put on staff as a sort of steward, writing letters for the men as I had done for Guillermo, reading to them, washing the less demanding wounds, and so forth, payment in room and board. As I have no other prospects, I have accepted the offer. I would just like to know what I have done to warrant this attention. Teague could not have known the date of the morning when he first woke without the urge to pull his stomach out through his throat and have done with the whole business. But he did know that something had happened between the time he tried to get out of the room and this morning, to take away all but the minor symptoms of his withdrawal. He didn't feel ill at all, aside from a headache and a weariness that kept him from sitting up or even changing his position in the bed. But if he could lift his eyes enough, he would be able to tell roughly what time it was based on whose turn it was to watch him. The old man sat ostensibly reading one of his medical journals, but had both eyes on Teague. "What day is it?" Teague whispered. "Monday," Warner replied as he set the journal aside. Teague tried to figure the number of hours he had been sleeping, but his mind had that familiar, comforting haziness that told him it didn't matter in any event. Warner must have read the confusion on Teague's face. "Do you remember yesterday at all?" he asked. Teague didn't think the question needed answering. After all, he had needed to be told the day of the week. "You collapsed. The vomiting and cramping had let up a bit, and you had just said a few words to Annalee about wanting some water when you fell back on the bed with no warning. You went so pale Annalee thought you were dead. You weren't far from it. It was Annalee who finally convinced me to inject the dosage of morphine I originally indicated when you were at the hospital. A third of what you've been taking recently, if you'll remember. When I saw your improvement, I realized how wrong I had been to think that anybody could withstand so drastic a change as what I had caused in completely depriving you of opium. I've made my share of mistakes, but I won't make that one again." Before Teague could congratulate his poor body for chastising the doctor, Warner continued. "But I still intend to break you of this habit." Warner offered Teague a cup of water, but though his tongue felt like it had swollen into his throat, Teague turned his head away. "Teague, why do you fight me?" Teague refused to answer such an asinine question. "I saw your face that night Caleb Logan mentioned Columbus," Warner pressed. "That look said you were going to make your way through the world dependent on no one but yourself. I don't understand how you can want self-reliance so badly and still act like this." "What could you possibly know of self-reliance? None of you can go a day without begging God to help you, be it for death or a hangnail." Warner did not respond as Teague hoped. There was no angry defense that anyone with a brain in his skull would go to God when he lost a part of his heart at the loss of a part of his family, to which Teague would have said he'd lost just that, but no one saw him kneeling. In his condition, it would take too much effort to get back up. Instead of a rebuttal, Warner sighed. "You're right. I can't depend only on myself. But neither can you. You know what it does to your body to abstain only a day. Will you be driven to ward off that pain for the rest of your life? Or will you help me resist it once and have done with it? If you don't, then you will always be just shy of independence, regardless of what you tell yourself." "All the opium in the world doesn't keep away my pain. What makes you think that none at all will work any better?" "There are some kinds of pain that never go away, son. I'm a doctor. I've known that for years." Teague stared into Warner's eyes. "I am not your son." Warner nodded and glanced down to the floor before returning the gaze. "I know. You're nobody's son, aren't you? You belong to no one, a man wholly unto himself. But you see, you're wrong. There is that one thing that binds you, that owns you. The master has become the slave, Teague, but I'll help you gain your freedom if you'll only let me." Teague didn't comment on the irony of helping independence because another, more pertinent thought came to him. "You wouldn't have me depend on God, either?" he asked, as though suspicious of goods a camp sutler might foist on him. "I won't deny that I wish you could find the peace he gives. But as long as you equate him with a drug, rather than a friend and father, no, I would not." Teague doubted Warner would truly be able to refrain from proselytizing for long. He had promised essentially the same thing before they'd left the hospital together. Yet, in the months that he had been at Oakshade, Teague could think of no major attempt to convert him. Perhaps Warner was leaving that up to his daughter. "Now, what opium I give you during this weaning process I have in mind will be contingent on your taking food and drink," Warner said as he held out the cup of water again. "I won't need it after this is over?" "That is my intention, though I've never actually done this before." Teague took the cup. "You inspire tremendous confidence," he said, before taking a sip.